This is the SF Productions Podcast Network.
This show is a Kung Fu Grip.
From the Pop Culture Bunker, I'm Mindy.
And I'm Mark. You can check out our audio podcast, How I Got My Wife to Read Comics, on iTunes or on our website, sfpodcastnetwork.com. On a previous episode of this show, I gave you a tour of the Pop Culture Bunker, including a lot of action figures.
A lot. Way too many.
So, who invented the term action figure? Well, that was Hasbro. Because they saw how much Mattel was making from Barbie, introduced in 1959, and wanted a toy for boys.
But it couldn't be a doll.
Because boys didn't heard the word dolls like, no.
We don't want a doll.
So they introduced G.I. Joe, America's Fighting Man, in 1964, 50th anniversary. He's a sailor, soldier, marine, and pilot. That was the original four figures.
Uh-huh.
Where's the cowboy and the Indian and the construction worker?
No.
So they were 12-inch figures, and they had tons of accessories, because they were basically following the Barbie model.
Right. They were Barbies, but for boys.
For boys. They sold licenses to G.I. Joe worldwide, so they were like Japanese versions of G.I. Joe and British versions and all this. But how do you actually trademark or copyright the human figure? That was the problem.
No.
Well, you don't, but you can put in unique features, so if somebody else does those, then, hey, you're infringing our copyright.
And that way, the kids say, oh, well, that's not a real G.I. Joe. He doesn't have the scar on his cheek.
Exactly. Or the trademark symbol on the right buttock.
Yeah, I don't think any of the kids were looking for that.
There was also the right thumbnail was on the underside of the thumb. Apparently, it was an accident made initially in the first run, and they just kept it.
Oh, that's interesting.
And then they put out dog tags for each of the figures. But as the opinion of the Vietnam War and the
public opinion changed towards the Army, the Navy.
Right. So they segued the G.I. Joe character into G.I. Joe Adventure Team in 1970. Meanwhile, Mego, who had sold these cheap promotional items in the 1960s, licensed 12-inch action figure rights in the early 70s to various pop culture things.
Okay.
Planet of the Apes. They did a whole Star Trek set. Actually, at one point they did Wizard of Oz.
Mm-hmm. And these were the toys that actually had real clothes, right?
Yeah, real clothes, and in some cases rooted hair, that type of thing. And keep in mind, licensing was a tiny part of the TV and movie industry back then.
Yes.
It wasn't the huge thing it was now.
No, there was no real licensing.
Right. And you'd basically, hey, the rookie attorney who just got here, just started, have him figure out the licensing. We don't care.
Yes.
So Mego acquired the rights to The World's Greatest Superheroes in 1972, which involved both DC and Marvel characters.
And that's really rare, isn't it, where one company has both of those? Exactly.
And in fact, they later had to sell the rights to the word superhero back to DC and Marvel.
Oh my gosh!
And so this is one of the rare cases, by the way, of one of these copyright terms being owned by two companies. Okay. Superhero is owned jointly by DC and Marvel.
Wow, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Now, I vividly remember the Mego figures. I actually had a Superman and an Aquaman. I have no idea why Aquaman figures.
Oh, because Aquaman.
As you said, rooted hair, fabric costumes. And Mego pretty much took over the action figure market until 1976.
What happened in 1976?
Well, Mego was offered this property that they went, I don't know, I don't know if that's going to go anywhere. It's too expensive. We're not interested. So Kenner, a division of General Mills at the time, well, still at the time, it basically part of that whole empire, got the rights to some movie called Star Wars, something like that. Yeah. And then the film premiered.
Oh, yes.
And Kenner was not ready. They actually had figures made, but they didn't have nearly enough quantity to fill up all the orders.
Because this really took off, obviously.
Yeah. And back then it took a very long time to make an action figure and actually get it to the store. So Christmas 1977, kids are clamoring for these Star Wars figures. They don't have them.
Yes.
So the early bird certificate package was sold. basically an IOU promising figures by the spring.
There you go.
Merry Christmas, kids. Here's a piece of cardboard. Millions of unsatisfied kids at Christmas 1977. So Kenner eventually did ramp up to speed, and they ended up selling 300 million of the Star Wars figures through 1985.
Yes.
It's an enormous thing. Now, most of them were between 3 and 4 inches tall instead of the much larger figures. Why? Yeah, well, the Mideast oil crisis made both the manufacture and shipping of bigger figures too expensive.
Again, another thing I never would have considered.
Because they're plastic, which
Yes.
means they're petroleum-based.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
So it's like smaller figures, and they're lighter and they're smaller, so we can ship more across the ocean and all this. So in the 1980s, action figure lines exploded, and some were based on cartoons that essentially sold the figures because Reagan's government loosened the rules on how cartoons could sell things.
Yes.
Basically said, do whatever you want.
Yeah, so basically, the cartoons were a 30-minute or however long ad
Right.
for the toys that you could go buy.
Exactly. And the best known of those were, of course, He-Man, Masters of the Universe. There was also, of course, Transformers, there was Thundercats, there was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and a boatload of imitators.
Yes.
That all were basically doing one of those. G.I. Joe returned, but now smaller, and there were hundreds of action figures of G.I. Joe.
Yes, and even through all this, Star Wars was still selling lots of action figures.
Right.
Yeah.
Suddenly, every sci-fi, superhero, action movie, or TV show had action figures.
This is from, I think, Hercules or
Yes.
Xena or something.
Right, and I believe this is from Spawn.
Yeah.
So, I spent some time in the 90s buying failed movie figures.
Yes. We had some fun with that for a while.
because basically you could buy them for a song.
Yeah.
Like Lost in Space or Wild Wild West.
Yes. Like $2 would get you this,
Huge thing, yeah.
Yeah.
90% off. So figures over time became more complex and collectible.
Mm-hmm.
McFarlane Toys sold expensive and very detailed figures. Spawn was one of those licenses that he was doing because, of course, Todd McFarlane created the character.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where he got all his money. The internet made it possible to easily buy and sell figures.
Yes.
And basically made collectible figures worthless. Because it was so easy to get them now. They're still rare figures, but...
Yeah, but I think it also led to the whole thing where, you've got these chase figures and things that, they only make one of for every 20 or whatever.
Right, absolutely.
And then you end up having to chase those. And also, with the releases of specialty figures that you can only get in certain places.
Right, exactly. Variant figures became huge. There was a whole set of Batman, with this Arctic Batman, and Piranha Blade Batman, and Neon Armor Batman.
Yes.
All over the place. And then by the 2000s, there was a push for nostalgic figures, which created a lot of Mego knockoffs. There was also the ability to easily do a 3D scan of a person.
Uh-huh.
So you could have your own action figure.
Yes.
And it also made it possible to create figures that are identical to the real thing, just smaller. I mean, figures from the 80s, the faces were basically blobs. I mean, they were
all the same. Superman looked like Green Lantern,
Yeah.
blah, 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 blah.
Now, I've mentioned that I've got a lot of action figures myself. A few of my purchases. I have the entire Playmates Simpsons set, except for one.
And I blame him entirely for
it's
that
all
one.
my fault, because it was a mail-in figure.
It was Toy Fair Magazine.
Yes.
I don't even know if they still have Toy Fair
No,
Magazine.
it's gone.
But they had, you could send in and get a radioactive, glow-in-the-dark Homer Simpson.
And it wasn't even that expensive, but I just didn't get around to it.
Well, actually, I asked you. I
Yep.
said, Mark, do you want me to send in and get this
Yeah.
figure? And you said, oh, I already have a Homer.
Yeah.
Okay, Mark.
I have like
now you
12
have
Homers, actually.
12 or 14 Homers.
Well, all I have to say is, don't! So, these figures came with sets that actually interacted with the figures. There was a little thing in their feet that would
Yes.
plug in, so they talked, and they'd say different phrases depending on which set you put them in.
Mm-hmm.
I got a lot of DC Direct collectibles. Now, you mentioned this earlier. These were only sold at your local comic book shop, not in the regular retail channel.
Right.
There were some obscure properties I purchased, like Mystery Men, if you remember that movie,
Yes.
circa 2000-ish, I think.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
The Tick, and this was the Tick figures from the short-lived live-action TV series.
Yes.
Serenity, Futurama, and recently I purchased some of those Mego knockoffs, but they're licensed ones.
Yes.
they're not rip-offs. And some of the new figures from the Batman 66 figures series. And then Mindy, you have a set of Doctor Who figures.
Yes. Yes. And then, interestingly enough, we've almost come full circle now, because you can go and get Barbies now that are dressed up like the comic book heroes or the science fiction heroes.
Oh, yeah, they put out a lot of them.
Licensed Barbies
Right.
that are now action figures.
Yeah.
So, it's a full circle.
Exactly.
I love those Barbies. So, while we're admiring our toys, you can check out our audio podcast, How I Got My Wife to Read Comics, on iTunes or on our website, sfpodcastnetwork.com. From the Pop Culture Bunker, I'm Mindy.
And I'm Mark. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.